Trim your feeble lamp, my brother, some poor sailor tempest tossed, trying now to make the harbor in the darkness may be lost. Let the lower lights be burning, send a gleam across the way. Some poor fainting, struggling seaman, you may rescue, you may save.
Okay, this brings us to our final part of the service, and that's Brother Jason will give his testimony at this time, so let's give him our attention.
Good evening to each one this evening. It's been good to be here so far. I've enjoyed what's been shared. So I was asked to give a life story and testimony. I was thinking this evening of the man Moses. Moses was a man that we admire because of the life that he lived. And we have a lot of his writings, the first 5 books of the Bible, but there's one other writing that we have, and that's in the book of Psalms, Psalm 90. And I'd like to just read a few words that he penned, and I'm not sure just what part of his life it was. But he says this, Lord, thou hast been our dwelling place in all generations. We spend our years as a tale that is told. So teach us to number our days that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom. Now, just to make sure that this is settled in your mind, I'll just tell you how old I am and how many years we're going to try to cover. And I wasn't quite sure if I could get this all in 1 minute per year or not. But I'm 75 years old. And I'm going to try to just give a little bit of a highlight here of some things in my life. You know, I had to think that every person has a unique story. And there are factors that mold our lives. And often decisions in life are made because of opportunities or maybe because of difficulties. And I believe that any true account or a true account of any life is going to include successes, it's going to include failures. And so I think that would be true if any of you would have anything to say here. All right, so I'm going to go back and just pick up a few highlights of my years. I was born in 1946 in Lebanon, Oregon. My parents, Melvin and Anna Roth Schrock, and I was the 6th of 8 children. First of all, I'd like to give just a little bit of my background and and home life, very briefly. I might just say this, that both of my grandfathers actually, my grandfather Schrock and my grandfather Roth, immigrated to the United States from the Alsace-Lorraine area of, I think it was Germany at that time. And they came as little boys, both of them. My Schrock grandfather ended up in Illinois. Later he moved to Colorado and Nebraska, and then moved to Albany, Oregon when my father was about 8 months old. So that's how my father got here to Oregon. On the Roth side, it's rather interesting. I do have a, whatever you call it, it's not really a bill of lading, but something that shows their passage from France to the U.S. and then a train passage to Iowa. And so they ended up in Iowa and then came to Albany, Oregon. My mother was about 5 years old at that time. So my father and mother were married in 1933 at the age of 24 and 19. A year later, before they had any children, my father was ordained to the ministry at the Fairview Church there at Albany. And so he became a minister at age 25. My mother was a minister's wife at age 20. And they were very concerned for the spiritual welfare of their family. They were concerned about the drift that they were seeing in the church of which they were a part. And so finally, I think it was after about 15 years of ministry there, they left in the hopes of finding a fellowship that would be more in line with their beliefs and convictions. Now, as far as home life, in my growing up years, we lived on a farm. My father was a farmer. And as most farms in that time, there was just a menagerie of livestock. He had several milk cows, some pigs, and laying hens, sheep, raised some cash crops, grass seed and grain, but a lot of it had to do with livestock. Before I was born, and so I would say at a fairly young age, my father had a very serious nervous breakdown to where he could not fulfill his duties at home. He couldn't take care of his work. He couldn't take care of his ministerial responsibilities in the church. I know he told about when he would go to church and thought he'd be all right. And well, here's Melvin, and he's here now, and one of the ministers, let's ask him to lead in prayer. He said that would unnerve him for about a week or so. He'd just have to leave. He couldn't handle it. One reason I'm saying that is that affected us as a family then, because he had what I would say is weak nerves probably all of his life. And when I was 11 years old, he decided that it would be good to just get away for a time, and he asked for you might say, a sabbatical leave from the Tangent Church at that time where he was minister. So the family went to Virginia for a school term, and we lived right close to the Eastern Mennonite College campus there in Harrisonburg, Virginia. My parents were not wealthy. We always had enough to eat, but we never had an overabundance of material things. My mother was a good hostess. She cooked good meals. She was seemed like there was nobody that was a stranger to her. They were, I would say, looking back, my parents were fairly strict disciplinarians, although they were very fair. And but they taught us a lot of Christian virtues and work ethics, honesty, and so on. And I had to think how my father retained an interest in the family, in the community, in the church, right up to his last days. I'd go over and see him. He lived right next to us there where John Culp's live now, and I would go over there, and he would ask me all kinds of questions, what's going on. All right, I'm going to say just a little bit about my 7 siblings. The more I thought about this, the more I just realized how they and their spouses had such an influence and a molding effect on how I looked at life. Part of that was most of them moved out of state. And so we did a fair amount of traveling to visit my family. We would go to Virginia, to Pennsylvania, to Maryland, Ontario, Canada, Mexico, North Carolina, and just interacted with a lot of people that way. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I thought it might be of interest to you just who my siblings were and are. The oldest in the family was my brother Paul, and he was about 10 and a half years older than me. He went to college at EMC. He married June Bontrager from New York, and his career was mainly with the Mennonite Publishing House in Scottsdale, Pennsylvania, where he was editor of periodicals and of books. I know he told me one time that it was his responsibility to edit and get to publication about 30 books every year. And so that was quite a job for him. My oldest sister then is Esther. She taught school 1 year at Lake Creek Mennonite School. And then she went to Amelia, Virginia, and taught there. And when she was there, she met her husband, Roy Mast, got married, and they lived in Virginia a number of years, and then moved to Mexico in the early 1980s. My sister Eunice, she worked at the Mennonite home, I think, as a nurse aide for a while. She married James Mast, who's a brother to Roy. They lived in Virginia many years. Now they're at Chewelah, Washington, and probably most of you know that they would be Earl's parents. My third sister, Melva Ann, she went to school in Ohio to take LPN nurses training. And after she got that, she went to Grassy Narrows, Ontario, under Northern Light Gospel Mission, and did nursing among the native population there. She married the 1W worker that was there, Marvin Zook from Pennsylvania. They lived at Grassy Narrows, and later in his home community in Pennsylvania, and now they live at Red Lake, Ontario. Rhoda's next in line. She also taught school at Lake Creek, and married Dean Mast, a cousin to Roy and James. They lived on a dairy farm a number of years at Amelia, and then they moved to Rutherford, North Carolina, which was an outreach from Amelia, and then recently they relocated to Zanesville, Ohio. Then I was number 6 in the family, about 2 years younger than my sister Rhoda and 4 years younger than my next sister, Julia. And so she went to Mount Airy, Maryland to teach school for a number of years. And there she met her husband, Mark Torkelson, lived in that community the rest of her life. And Mark is a deacon in the Eastern Church. I think I forgot to mention there then that my brother Paul died about 11 years ago. My brother Julia about 10 years ago. Then John, a lot of you would know John. He's the youngest in the family, 8 years younger than me. And as a little tyke, he was a favorite of his parents and his siblings. But he made a lot of wrong choices in life, served a number of years in prison. He was converted while in prison. He got out and married Elizabeth McPherson. Later, they separated and divorced. He married again, but after a time separated from his wife because he knew that their relationship was unscriptural. She then passed away, and he still lives here in Halsey. And so, as I think of those siblings of mine, and I just would like to say this, because I think each one of us that's part of a family, we have quite an influence on the rest of our family, whether we're in the same household or whether we just relate maybe on a basis of more of a distance. Okay, so where did we live? When I was a little fella, my family lived in a house just less than a mile from the Fairview Church. If you go down Galtra Road to get to Stutzman Drive, turn down there, and that's where my family lived. That was kind of the Roth home place. And so I was there till I was 4 years of age. And then my parents bought a farm west of Tangent, about 2 miles west of Tangent on Hink Drive now. And we lived there for 12 years. And then, of course, I mentioned about the 9 months that we were in Virginia during that time. And then after, when I was 16 years of age, my father sold that farm and bought a little mini farm on old Highway 34, just across the railroad track to the north, and lived there then until I got married. All right, now I'm going to talk just a little bit about my health or lack thereof. As I was, as a baby I was, and as a child, I had very much of a problem with asthma. I was an asthmatic. I remember my mom saying that she went to a doctor, and she asked the doctor, she says, "What do you do with a 6-month-old baby?" 6 week maybe it was. I'm not sure, doesn't matter. Say a 6-month-old baby that has asthma. He said, "I just raise my hand and yell fire." She was so mad at him. But she said, in later years she really appreciated him because he didn't try to pretend like he knew what to do. And so anyhow, I had that problem as a boy. I had many allergies. I had to try as much as possible to stay away from dust and mold, and certain foods I couldn't eat, and some of the foods I couldn't eat, I've made up for them since then, now that I can eat them, such as crab and eggs and corn, sweet corn. Some of those things I couldn't eat. It would give me an attack. I couldn't exercise strenuously. Something I just thought about this evening. I guess it's all right to say that, but my parents hardly knew what to do with me, because if they would give me too hard of a spanking, I'd get an attack. And my siblings thought, sure, this fella is really going to be spoiled because he doesn't get enough discipline. I don't know what they'd say today. It's all right. As a preschooler, I was hospitalized for about a week. They didn't know what was wrong with me, never did find out what was wrong with me. My parents really thought that I would not survive. At about 10 years of age, I began to take allergy injections. First it was weekly, and then every 3 weeks eventually. And I kept this up till in my 40s, so it was probably over 30 years that I did that. And so I've had relatively good health since middle age. After I got married, my grandmother told me, she says, "I did not think you would ever get married, because you were such a sickly child." And as I go back and look at pictures today of me as a child, I am a hunched over, skinny fella. Now you might have a hard time believing, but I was skinny. Didn't have much to me. All right, now I'm going to go on to my education. I went from first grade through high school. 7 years I was in grade school at the Tangent grade school right here in this town, and then the 1 year at Harrisonburg, Virginia. High school, I went 2 years at Lake Creek. And then because of my health issues, my parents really felt that I should get more education than 10 years, so I went then to 2 years to Albany High School in Albany. And there I needed to study quite hard to get the right credits to graduate. Somehow or another, the courses that were offered at Lake Creek, they accepted some of them, I think they accepted the Bible course as Old World History or whatever, but there were about, I think, 10 different credits I needed to be able to graduate. So I had to really, really work hard. And in those 2 years, I learned study habits. I learned how to do research. And actually, one of my classes was bookkeeping, which I really enjoyed and came into, it really helped me out in my occupation in later life. I went to Bible school 6 weeks, or 2 years each of 6 weeks at Messiah Bible School, and that was a highlight in my youth. I was thinking I could mention some of my peers. It might be of interest to you. And if I don't mention someone, it's not because you weren't important, but I thought maybe there was one that I might mention, and that's Wilbur Zare. I guess I can talk about him since he's not here. But their family lived over toward Lebanon, and they were in what was known as the LaSalle School District. And they were trying to determine at that time whether LaSalle was going to continue on as a little country school or if they were going to consolidate and send the students to the larger town of Tangent. Well, the year that I was getting ready to be in the first grade and Wilbur was getting ready to be in the first grade, they decided to consolidate that. So Wilbur and I started school together, first grade, at Tangent. And we were actually, now he didn't go to Lake Craig, but we were actually in school together all the way through till we graduated from high school. And when we were there at Albany High School, we'd about always eat our lunch together. It was really nice to have someone there to relate to. You might have a hard time believing this, but Wilbur was just a little bit ornery. And my mother was one that in those days really had to bundle up her children to make sure they didn't catch cold or pneumonia or something else. And so I always had to wear a cap. That was a target for Wilbur. He would come and swipe the cap off my head and throw it somewhere and run off laughing. Okay, that's probably enough of that. I'm supposed to be talking about my life story, not his. All right. But you know, I thought about a number of different peers that I would have related to over the years and the influence that they had on my life. All right, now that my next major point here, I have work opportunities as a young person. So what do younger people do? Well, we had some opportunities that children today don't have. One thing that we did was to pick produce. We'd pick strawberries, and we would pick green beans. The green beans then, now today they're just bush beans, and they go out with a machine and harvest them, but then they were pole beans, and we'd go out and pick those beans. Somebody asked me here not too long ago, well, what do we get paid for that? Well, as I recall, we were paid 2.5 cents a pound. So we would pick, we would take it up, and they would weigh it, and then they would punch on a punch card, and at the end of the season, we'd get paid for that. And if we stayed with the same farmer all the way through, they'd give us a quarter of a cent bonus. Okay, so a good day for me was about maybe 150 pounds, or a fairly good day. My sisters could get well over 200, but say 150 at, 2.5 cents? I mean, that doesn't seem like a lot of money, but it was enough to buy a few school clothes and so on then. Okay, other than that, one year I was hired as a row boss for a strawberry field. And my main assignment there was to check and make sure that the pickers were picking clean and to make sure that there weren't too many strawberries thrown between the pickers. That was kind of what I was supposed to do there. I drove combine in grass fields. I worked at a couple warehouses sacking seed. 2 springs I was in Amelia, Virginia, between Bible school and time to come home. One spring I worked in a farm store, and the other spring on a carpenter crew. All right, I'll get back a little bit later. I'll get to later occupation. I'd like to talk a little bit about spiritual life now. We would have had, I would say we had good teaching. We had good teaching in the home, in Sunday school, in Bible school, but we did not have the benefit, like our children now have, of learning a lot of the Bible stories and memorization and some of those things in school. But the parts of the Bible that I would have memorized in Bible school, in Sunday school, even in children's meeting, we'd have sometimes somebody at children's meeting that would have children's meeting for the whole month and have us learn a passage. But those things have stuck with me. And so I think it's so important that our children memorize. In those days, there was a lot of emphasis on making a decision to follow the Lord, and even for younger children. And so, at 10 years of age, I made a decision to follow the Lord, and I was baptized. As I look back, I think that was not probably the best thing for my spiritual life, because I was a Christian, but I didn't really completely understand the sinful nature of man. And so I really tried to watch that with my children when they come along. That's one thing I wanted to make sure that they understood the sinful nature of man before they would be considered to be born again. And so I would say that caused struggles in my spiritual life, in my Christian life, right on up into adult years. I wonder, well, now was I really born again? And I would cry out to the Lord, and I would pray, and I would come to Him. I would say that as far as the spiritual life, the decisions that my parents and our church made in leaving an apostate setting had a tremendous effect on the direction that I took. Also, the teaching that I received at Bible school, some of those things still stick with me today, and I appreciate that. All right, now I'm going to come back to business life. I talked a little bit about work opportunities. So as a young adult, when it was time to get married, or right a little bit before that, I wanted to find a place I could work that would not affect me so bad with my allergies. And so I went from place to place, and I put in applications here and there. It just seemed like nothing opened up other than just working a seed warehouse. Well, by then I could tolerate a certain amount of dust. And so I began working for a man by the name of George Smith about 6 weeks before I got married. And I sacked off seed in his warehouse, mostly in the daytime, part of it at night. And he worked us 6 days a week, 11 hours a day. So this time of the year, I saw no daylight at home. That was just kind of the expected thing. And but he was a farmer that started cleaning grass seed, his own, and then some neighbors. he began to load rail cars and began to buy and sell seed. And so with a growing business, he needed a full-time bookkeeper. Now his daughter, some of you would know her, Diana Headings, she was keeping books half days, but she wanted to quit. And so he found out that I had interest in bookkeeping and wanted to know if I would be bookkeeper. So I, after working in the warehouse the one winter, then the next summer, I unloaded trucks there at the warehouse. And then I went in to be a bookkeeper. I always kind of like this story, and when I tell it, I almost wonder if I remember it correctly. But I had probably worked in the office maybe 6 weeks, 2 months. And George came to me one day and he says, and I was keeping books, and so he and I were the only two in the office. He said, you know, he said, Mom and I haven't had a vacation in a number of years. Do you think you could run things here while we take a vacation, go to Hawaii? Sure, just go ahead and go. I had a wonderful time. Bought and sold seed. I dispatched the trucks. I kept the books and everything. And he came back. The business was still intact, and it was an interesting experience. So in the next 10 years, as the business grew, we needed more help. We needed help in bookkeeping and dispatching and marketing. Paul's there, Daniel Hertzler, Ken Workinger came in as workers. But George wanted to retire. He said, I paid enough into Social Security, I want to get everything out I can. So he asked me if I'd be interested in taking over the business. He said, if you are, he said, we'll try to keep building it up. If you're not, I'm going to start shutting it down. Well, I said, yeah, I think I would be interested. And the way it turned out then, Paul Zaire and Danny Hertzler and I formed a partnership, took the business over in 1976, and then Danny left the partnership 7 years later. And we didn't set out to be a big company. That wasn't our intent. That wasn't our goal. But what we did try to do was to meet the needs of our customers, to try to be a service to the local farmers, and to take care of our employees. And so today, Smith Seed Services is the result of that. All right, now I'd like to talk about my family just a little bit. And I could say a lot about my family, I guess, but I was married in 1966 to Marilyn Krupp. She was the daughter of Herman and Mildred Krupp. We lived in the Halsey area. And I think I'm just going to mention the children, not, again, maybe kind of like my siblings, not detailed, but once again, the children have had such impact on the decisions that I made in my life. Jeff is the oldest. He taught 1 year of school at the Lake Creek School. He married Carolyn Berkey, and then at a later time, they moved to Chewelah, Washington at the request of the Tangent Church. And as most of you probably know, and I'm going to mention that a little bit later, but they lost 5 children in an accident. After that, they served 2 years as a director, a field director there in Belize, and they continued to reside at Chewelah. Laura was our oldest daughter, and she's married to John Smucker. After they got married, John taught, I think it was 1 year in Pennsylvania and 5 in Virginia. And then they served 10 years in Poland. And after they returned from Poland, John was ordained minister here at Halsey, and they were chosen to move to the new outreach of Madras. Esther was number 3, and she was kind of the life of the family gatherings. She married Lowell Troyer, and they lived at Payette, Idaho for several years. And Lowell was involved in concrete business there. And then, as most of you are aware, she passed away from cancer then in 2018. Marcus was next, and He was adopted from El Salvador. We as a family went to El Salvador to pick him up, to bring him home here to live. He married Rhoda Kurtz in 1999, and he's been involved in construction and sales and mason work. Maybe I could just tell a little story on that. When we brought him, we came to the Los Angeles airport. And of course, we had this foreign child that we had to process. And he was not just the happiest that day, and neither was his older sister, Esther. Because it was a hot day, they put us in kind of a little room trying to process him, and he was crying, and we didn't quite know it was going to take some little time. But finally, Esther just turned to him and she said, "You little immigrant, you," and that kind of cut the tension there. All right, Sarah was the last daughter of Marilyn and mine. She taught several years at the Russian school in Spokane and also at the church school at Chewelah. Then she married her co-teacher, Gerald Hooley, and they live at Chewelah. So after 18 years of marriage, Marilyn passed away of cancer, and I'll have just a little bit more to say about some of these things later. About a year and a half after Marilyn's death, I married a widow, Ruth Culp Krupp. She was a daughter of Richard and Mary Culp, and she had been married to Sam Krupp. When we got married, Ruth had been a widow for about 5 years, and she had 3 children from her first marriage. Ed was a farmer at heart, began farming at a young age. And then later, he and his family moved to Chewelah, where he did some farming, some mobile slaughtering and sales. Then he was ordained deacon for the Pine Grove congregation. And then they were asked to move to Hamilton, Montana, in an outreach where he continues to serve as deacon, and that's at the Bitterroot Church there. Jolene was next, and I think one of her claims to fame was that in all of her 10 years of school at Lake Creek, she never missed a day. She had perfect attendance for the whole 10 years. And then she has taught a number of years, special ed, remedial reading. She did serve for a short time at the Hummingbird Mission in Belize. Judy was next, the youngest of Ruth's children, and she would have been, I think probably about 3 weeks old when her father was killed. So Judy, and of course Jolene, I don't think either would have remembered him. But Judy taught school at the Russian school in Portland for several years. She served a term of service in Romania and married Raymond Zare. And they live over at Culver at this time. So then Ruth and I, after we were married, we had 3 additional children. Regina, she taught a year of school at, I guess that probably would have been Lighthouse at that time. And then she taught music for a number of years and had her own business, a country home and fabric in Albany, for several years. She married Lyndon Troyer in 2017. Then Joel is next, and he taught school for 7 years. He's now involved at Smith Seed as general manager, and he married Sarah Durstein, and they live in the Harrisburg area. And Ryan, if I remember right, taught school 2 years, also Lighthouse, and has worked for Smith Seed in the bag division more recently, managing the coding department, and just last month, right? He married Grace Yoder from Ohio. There was 28 years between my oldest and youngest son. And there's some interesting things that could be said about that. But one thing, I would have attended registration meetings and been involved in school for 39 years. from the beginning to the end of my children's school days. I would say that my children have been such a blessing and such a support in the experiences of life, and I now have 38 living grandchildren and 5 deceased and 3 great-grandchildren. So then, in 2017, I married Elsie Hostetler Mast, and she had lived in Arkansas for around 40 years, had been married to Lowell Mast. She was a widow for about 13 years, and so I've learned to know and relate to her 4 sons and 1 daughter and their spouses, and her 17 grandchildren. So that kind of gives a snapshot of the family, of my wives and my children and some of the surrounding things there. I thought it might be interesting for those of you that know the area here to know where we lived after marriage. After marriage, Marilyn and I stayed in Chris Scheffel's house for 5 months while they were in Florida for the winter. Chris Scheffel's house would be on Nixon Drive, just west of David Berkey's place there, on the south side of the road, first place on the left there. We were there 5 months, and then we moved from there to what is known as a Commons house, which would be the house which is just south of Leland's place, the next place south. We lived there for 8 years. And then we moved to where Ernest Berkey's had lived, on Powerline Road there for about 1.5 years. And then when we took over the business there at Smith Seed, moved there. And I think if I got it right, lived there 44 years. And now the present location where Elsie and I live, we moved there in May of 2020. All right, now I'd like to share just a little bit about some of the major losses in my life, and I'm sure most of you are aware of this. The first would be the death of Marilyn in 1984. I guess I would just say that in many ways, I was not prepared for anything like this. I had never really faced the death of anyone close. Probably the closest was a grandparent. And I remember there in September of '83, Marilyn had a lump that wouldn't seem to go away. She had done some doctoring, and so finally she went to the medical doctor and to check it out, just to see if he could figure out what was going on. She was tested while she was there. She came home and got me off to the side. She said, "I need to tell you," she said, "I have inflammatory carcinoid cancer." I guess carcinoid is cancer. It was a very aggressive form of breast cancer. So what should we do? We talked to the oncologist. I asked him, I said, what would you do if this was your wife? He said, I don't know. I really don't know what I'd do, but I think it'd be good if she had some chemo, and then if that is somewhat successful, then we do some radiation and so on. So that's what we did. She took chemotherapy, took some radiation, but that didn't take care of it. And so we did then make several trips down to Mexico in the Tijuana area. But after 14 months of fighting that battle, she succumbed to the cancer and passed away. And so, as I said, that was it was something I wasn't really prepared for. Maybe we're never prepared for something like that. And it was very difficult. And I had 5 children at home at the time, from the ages 17 down to 2.5. And I was determined that we would all stay together. And so we did. I guess next then, as far as deaths, would be the deaths of my parents. This was in 1997. As a family, we had a trip planned going to Mexico and to Central America to visit relatives and friends. And we had just started, got to Mexico one day, and that late, actually it was early morning, I guess, and late that evening, got the call that my parents had been in a traffic accident over on Crook and Power Line, right there by Belco. And so my father and Evelyn Krupp were killed instantly. My mother had serious injuries and died 10 days later. That probably was not quite as difficult as losing a spouse, but it was difficult because, you know, they lived right beside us, and I always depended on them, talked to them a lot, and they were gone. Now, one thing I really remember that I felt, whenever I would go somewhere for meetings, to speak at meetings, I knew my parents would be praying for me. That wasn't anymore. They were gone. And that did affect me. All right, then next I'd like to mention about the death of the 5 grandchildren, Jeff and Carolyn's 5 children, ages 12 down to 2. Clayton Eveleth called me one afternoon. He said, or evening, I guess it would have been. He said, I don't know if you know it or not, but he said Jeff was in an accident. He's in the hospital. I think he said he had a broken arm or something, or leg. And at this point, he had the children with him, but at this point, we don't know for sure where they are. We're trying to get more information, but I thought I'd at least let you know that much. So here we sit. Well, what's going on? And our daughter, Sarah, was teaching school up there at the time, and she was in contact with Ruth off and on. A few hours later, Sarah called and talked to Ruth, and Ruth said, all of them? And that's what we heard again and again, all of them. Found out that all 5 had been killed in the accident. Jeff was in the hospital in serious condition. And so Ernest and Louise and Ruth and I got a ride to Spokane that night. That was Leon and Arlen Schrock, right? Arlen Schrock and Leon kindly took us up to Spokane. We left probably about midnight and didn't get up there till about, it was a little after, probably a little before 8 o'clock the next morning. And got to see Jeff. He was really, really banged up, had broken jaw, had broken collarbone. He had his wrists, his pelvis, I forget what all it was. And so he had a month of therapy, recuperation. Ernest and us took turns being up there by the week to take care of him, even after he returned home. He was in the hospital in Spokane 2 weeks, the hospital in Chihuahua 2 weeks, and I think it was about another month till he was ready to leave home. So that was a very traumatic thing for us, to just have 5 grandchildren like that taken at one time. I already mentioned just a little bit, my brother Paul passed away in 2011. He was coming down a stairway where he was volunteering to work, and no one knows for sure if he stumbled, if he blacked out or what, but he fell about 5 steps, hit his head on concrete. He came to a little bit. They took him into the emergency room, and he was soon in a coma, and the doctors said that he would not recover. At that time, Ruth and I were in Los Angeles. She was in the hospital with surgery, and didn't know how this was all going to work out. But she got out of the hospital, I think about the same day he passed away, and I was able to go to the funeral. She wasn't. Then about a year later, we were again in Los Angeles, and Ruth was scheduled for surgery number 2. The morning of her schedule there, we got a call from Mark Torkelson, my brother-in-law. He said, I have some not so good news for you. And he told me then how Julia had, the night before, how she'd gone upstairs to go to bed. She called out and she said, my head's hurting. And long story short, she had bleeding on the brain, not really an aneurysm, but bleeding on the brain, and she died a few hours later. So those were difficult times for me as well, to lose a brother and sister. Then the next one would be the death of another wife, of Ruth. She started out basically by having some puffy eyes, and we took her for different testing, trying to find out what was going on. And after a lot of testing, we found out that she had what's called carcinoid tumors in the liver. It's a cancer. And in doing some research, we found a doctor in Los Angeles that specialized in this condition. And so we took many trips down there to see this doctor. And we felt like we got a lot of information, a lot of help. 2 surgeries. She went through a clinical trial, some special medications, and lived a fairly normal life during that time. But she did finally succumb to the disease after about 5 years of fighting that. And so at the time she passed away, still had 3 children at home, all of them adults. And so they really helped me work through that time, and I hoped I helped them a little bit too. And then one other thing I'd like to mention is the death of Esther, my second daughter. Shortly after Ruth's death, we found out that Esther had breast cancer. And the type that she had was considered to be quite treatable. She had chemo and radiation and went into remission, and it looked like the cancer was conquered. We were all rejoicing, but about a year later, it came back with a vengeance. And she also did some treating in Mexico, and then she passed away in October of 18. I don't even think I should try, but I've tried to figure or to think, is it more difficult to lose a wife or a daughter? They're both difficult. And I've just thought about Esther a lot, in the last few years since she's gone, how much we miss her. So each one of these deaths of family members had a definite impact on my life. Which way was I to go? How was I to relate to all this? Was God punishing me? Why these repeated losses? And we fervently prayed. Why didn't God answer? Why didn't He do what I thought He ought to do? And I would say it was times of trying our faith. But each time I found that the grace of God would carry us through. Another thing I found was, at the times of losses like that, the Word of God became so precious. I would immerse myself in reading the Word and find so much comfort there. All right, now I'd like to talk just a little bit about my church ministry. As well, I would say Marilyn and I, and then later Ruth and I, and so on, we were active in the church. Sunday school teachers, Bible school. I was Bible school superintendent different times. I was chorister for about 15 years straight. So in 1974, at the age of 28, I was ordained deacon. And 2 years later, I was ordained minister in 1976. We needed a minister, and then that didn't really, it didn't really help a whole lot. We needed more ministerial help, and it was another 5 years until Paul Zare was ordained deacon to replace me. One thing I just thought about right before church this evening, when I was ordained minister, I guess I was a little insecure as to how to go about a sermon and that sort of thing. And I would study. I put in a lot of study, and I get notes together, and I knew that the Lord had a message to give, but how was I supposed to convey it to people? So there in the early months, well, probably years of my ministry, I would get my notes, and I would go out to the Smith Seat office, where my office was, on a Sunday morning, and I would preach that sermon to those four walls, just to try to get it in my mind and to practice. And thought about that here. It's been a while. Been a while since I've done that, but I think it helped. So during the 48 years of my ministry, I have been involved in Bible school a number of years. I was trying to figure that up here today. I think I taught 13 years at 4 different Bible schools, and then I was principal 7 years, so that was a total of 20 years that I've been involved in Bible school. Also during that time, there were a number of times I went as a speaker for Bible conferences and weekend meetings and revival meetings, and I don't know if this is even good information, but I kind of like statistics. So I got to do a little bit of figuring. As near as I could figure, I went about 60 times for meetings like that in 20 states and 3 provinces and 2 foreign countries over that period of time. I would like to say that I've greatly appreciated the brotherhood here at Tangent and at Halsey. It's been an encouragement. It's been a blessing to serve here, and in many ways, serving in the ministry here I wouldn't say it's been easy, but it has been a blessing. And one thing I do appreciate so much is how the congregation here stood with our family during times of grief and joy and the things that we've faced. Nearly 5 years ago, I began to write some of the things in relation to my life. I'd had encouragement to do that, and I've piecemealed that for a number of years, just about done, I guess. But I wrote then, kind of in retrospect, after writing all these things, here's what I wrote. I've tried to piece together aspects of a life shattered again and again by deep sorrow, and yet experiencing repeated times of restoration. Life brings many experiences, the expected and unexpected, joys and sorrows, fulfilled dreams and shattered plans, satisfaction and disappointments. My life has been a patchwork of these various aspects. And so I think we find that to be true. I'm sure you all find that to be true in your lives. That there are times of joy, there's times of sorrow, there's times of discouragement, there's times of, but we need to seek the Lord and retain faith. As a few closing thoughts, I'd just like to share a little bit here. When Ruth was in the hospital, I guess it was about close to 2 weeks she was in the hospital before she passed away. I would go in there every day, and I found that I just got a lot of encouragement by reading Psalm 71. And I would read that every day. I'd go in there, and as soon as I had maybe fed her a little bit of breakfast and visited with her and things were calmed down, I'd sit down and I'd read Psalm 71. And so I'd like to conclude this as a testimony and just read a few verses or parts of verses here if you want to listen. In thee, O Lord, do I put my trust. Let me never be put to confusion. Save me, for thou art my rock and my fortress. Thou art my trust from my youth. Cast me not off in the time of old age. Forsake me not when my strength faileth. But I will hope continually and will yet praise thee more and more. O God, thou hast taught me from my youth, and hitherto have I declared thy wondrous works. Now also when I am old and gray-headed, O God, forsake me not until I have showed thy strength unto this generation, and thy power to everyone that is to come. Thou which hast showed me great and sore troubles shalt quicken me again, and shalt bring me up again from the depths of the earth. So those are the things that I decided to share. I'm sure there's a lot more that could be said and maybe should have been said, and probably maybe some things that shouldn't have been, but that's all right. So thank you for your attention. May the Lord bless you.
Thank you very much, Jason. That was an encouragement to me. As I was sitting there listening to that and thinking back through all the difficulties that you faced, it feels, for me at least, that you're probably more of an encouragement to us than we've been to you. And at least to me, that's the way it is. And I really appreciate you and your family and what you've done for this community and this church. And as I've thought about your life too before, to me it's a wonderful example of what the power of God can do in a human being, to be able to go through what you have and still have a testimony for Christ. It only can be done. It's only possible with the love of God in our life and being broken before Him. So thank you for being willing to share in that way. That's all I have. Is there any other announcements or anything that anybody has? Okay, if not, why don't we stand for closing prayer? Father in heaven, just thank you for this day that you have given to us. Thank you for the many wonderful things that we've heard today, the encouragement that we received. We thank you that we can gather together in this way with other people, other saints and people that believe in you. And we thank you that you are a God that never changes and that you're still as powerful today as you ever were. Just guide and direct each one here this week. Be with the ones that are sick among us and can't be here. Pray that you would heal them if it's not against your will. Be with those tonight that are struggling and maybe they're depressed and don't see a way out. Help them to somehow find their way clear to you and come to you and find their strength there. We just ask your blessing on this audience as we part from here. We pray this all in your name. Amen.